Hello. For today's video, I'm talking about all of the books that I read in the month of November. In all, I think I read 10 books? Maybe? I don't know. But I'm going to talk about them now. The first book that I finished in November was The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist by Radley Balko and Tucker Carrington. This is nonfiction. I requested it from the library for Nonfiction November, which is a readathon hosted by Olive from A Book Olive to basically just encourage you to read more nonfiction, which is great. So I requested this from the library with that in mind, and then it just happened to come a little early, so I started it a little early, but I finished it in November. I liked it. I wasn't totally over the moon about it, but I did like it. This book looks at how in the state of Mississippi there were two men, the titular Cadaver King and the Country Dentist, who basically led to a ton of false imprisonment due to shitty autopsies and to testimonies in court that either were totally baseless or based on pseudoscience and things like that. I think the topic itself was really interesting. I appreciated the fact that both Carrington and Balko really sought to examine the underlying structural causes that allowed for these two men to become so prominent in the state of Mississippi, and how that structure is itself inherently racist, and it looks at the ways that racism plays within the system. I read the audiobook, which was fine. Nothing that totally blew me away, but it wasn't like it was a bad audiobook. It just got the job done. I had trouble because the way the book is structured is that in addition to these two men, the story also kind of revolves around two particular cases. Basically, it talks about two child murders, and that was really, really hard for me to read. I struggled with that quite a lot. That was just like a personal preference type of thing. I don't think they sensationalized those parts of the stories, but I just really struggled with them. And then at times I found that the book dragged a little bit. It was just a little tedious sometimes to get through, but overall I still did enjoy it. Next, I read A Dash of Trouble by Anna Mariano. This is middle grade supernatural fantasy. I don't know. It's set in the real world. We follow little Nora, who is a young girl who discovers that her family, the women in her family specifically, may have some magic, and that magic relates to baking. She wants to get involved with all that despite being too young, and then mayhem ensues. I thought this was really cute and sweet, but it skewed too young for me. I like some middle grade, but I really think I prefer like the older end of that demographic. This was just too young for me. That's not to say it's a bad book. I just didn't really enjoy it because it skewed so young. However, if you're looking for a good book for younger readers that are like beyond the teeny tiny Magic Treehouse books, I think this would be perfect. It just wasn't for me personally, which is okay. Next, I read Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix by J.K. Rowling, and I had such a good time reading this. It was so much fun. I think the themes that Rowling looks at in this book are some of the most compelling in the series. I think this is the first book where we really get to see Rowling explore a theme that exists throughout the series, that adults are fallible. But this is where we see like the ultimate, almost deified adult figure in Dumbledore prove that he ain't perfect. And I think that's really, really compelling. Another thing that stood out to me was that as an adult reading this, I was a lot less angry at Harry or annoyed at him and more annoyed and angry with him. My voice just cracked a little bit. When I was younger, I was like, why is he so moody? This time around, it's like, oh, he's moody for a reason. And it's the adults who choose to, close the door and leave him out of the room that are really frustrating. So that was an interesting thing reading. This is one of my favorites in the series. I do think it's too long. I think it needed to be edited a bit. And I also think that J.K. Rowling has a problem when it comes to depicting stereotypically feminine things, and it really stands out in this book. If you look at the majority of her female figures that you're supposed to like and empathize with, they tend to exhibit more stereotypically masculine traits. They shy away from like beauty and style and hair and makeup and stuff. And when Molly Weasley does kind of do those things, it's supposed to be a comedy bit, if that makes sense. And in this we have Umbrage, who is like one of the most hated characters of all time, I would say. And she is aggressively feminine. And I think her character is very interesting, and on its own, I wouldn't say that it represents like a problem with devaluing feminine things, but I think Umbrage in conjunction with like Cho Chang and Madame Puttyfoots and the ongoing bit with Lavender Brown and Padma Patil being obsessed with divination, and like they think the new divination teacher's so hot and they're supposed to seem kind of dumb for that. So I think she's got a bit of a problem there. Something that I noticed that stood out to me a lot. But that said, I still love these books so much. Like, very little is going to change that, including Rowling's idiotic behavior on social media and like around the Fantastic Beasts and like that whole mess. these books I still love. Next I read We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. This was another audiobook, and this was a fabulous audiobook. So if you're thinking about picking this up, the audiobook is definitely something to check out. I loved this. This is considered Jackson's like masterpiece and just a masterwork in general when it comes to unreliable narrators, which is not a spoiler. You pick up pretty quickly that there is something off about the main character in this. There's a girl named Mary Catherine, also known as Mary Cat, who lives in an old mansion with her older sister and her uncle. Once upon a time, their family was very large and they all lived together in this mansion, and something happened. It's a slow burn. I don't think it's like a mystery in the traditional sense. I had figured out what had happened pretty early on. It's more this fascinating character study. And to me, it almost read like a play because the setting is very limited. You spend almost the entire book in this mansion. There's like one scene, I think, of Mary Cat going into town to do shopping, but otherwise you're in this mansion. And the dialogue at times feels kind of circular, and I just think really lends itself to the atmosphere of a stage play, which was really cool. Totally recommend it if you're looking for like a really creepy read. Definitely check it out. Next, I read The Plague of Doves by Louise Erdrich, and I struggled with this. It wasn't my favorite. I think intellectually, it's brilliant, but I didn't enjoy myself when I was reading it. The book is centered around like two violent acts, and then it looks at how those two things affected the lives of people in this town and in the nearby Indian reservation. I think I would have enjoyed it more in like a classroom setting where you're having lots of discussions and doing like deep analysis, but just for me, reading for my own enjoyment, I struggled with the sheer number of perspectives. I get why they were in there. It is a mix of kind of like oral traditions, but then also looking at how these events affected a myriad of people, and then also looking at how any one perspective of what happened is incomplete, and it looks at how those events have like a trickle down and how there's generational trauma around them. And all of that is brilliant, and structurally I think Erdrich's writing supports that. I totally get why it was nominated for a Pulitzer. I really struggled with enjoying it. And I think something that I'm noticing is that regardless of the quality of the work, when there are a ton of narrators, I have a hard time. I've noticed this in not very good books, and I've noticed this in objectively very good books. I just struggle to enjoy them when there's a ton of perspectives. So I think that's what was going on here for me. Next, I read The Proposal, I just hit my hip. I read The Proposal by Jasmine Guillory. This is a contemporary romance that I liked. I loved Guillory's debut, The Wedding Date. I thought that was so cute, so wonderful. A lot of the things that I liked in this were things that I enjoyed in The Wedding Date as well. I like that the world that Guillory creates reflects the world around us. The main couple that you're like rooting for in all of this is a Black woman and a Mexican-American guy. They both have very rich lives independent of their romantic relationships. So they have careers and career goals and supportive friends and family, and that's all great. What I noticed about this was that I struggled with the writing itself a little bit. There were so many semicolons, so many, to the point where obviously I noticed it and I'm now talking about it. I also thought a lot of the dialogue was pretty clunky and not how people actually speak. So those were two things where I was like, no, I'm not crazy about that. Overall, I still liked it, and I think if you're looking for like a lighter read that doesn't make you feel awful after you read it because it's garbage, then this is great because it is decidedly not garbage and has a lot of good stuff going for it. Next, I read The Astonishing Color of After by Emily X.R. Pan. This is YA contemporary fabulism. There's some kind of supernatural stuff going on, which I'll get into in a minute. I loved this. It's gorgeous. The writing is gorgeous. The structure is really cool. I just all around loved it. In this, we follow Lee, whose mother has recently died, and she is convinced that her mom has transformed into a giant red bird and that she needs to go to Taiwan, which is where her mom's from, in order to like find this red bird, find her mother, something like that. Structurally, the book is a mix of what is going on in Taiwan, like present day. Then there's a bit that examines what was happening leading up to her mother's death. And then the third is this mix of memories. And some of them are Lee's own memories, some of them are her father's memories, some of them are her mother's memories. It's not clear how accurate those are. I tended to think that they were totally accurate. I just loved this. It's an exploration of grief. It's an exploration of having a parent with a mental illness, with depression. I will give a content warning for this for obviously depression and also suicide. There's a lot of understandable fear and anxiety around treatment of mental illness, specifically of depression. There's talk of like pills and the pills not working. There's talk of ECT, which is electroconvulsive therapy. This book doesn't fall into the trap that I think we do see a lot of the time in depictions of mental illness and discussions of mental illness, where needing to take medication is somehow like admitting defeat and showing that you're weak or something like that. So this book doesn't do that, which is great. What it does do is show some of the anxiety about what are more invasive treatments. ECT is not electroshock therapy, which is like old school, terrifying 1950s evil stuff. With ECT, you're anesthetized, you get a couple like electric jolts into your brain, but it's very, very, very specific. And the goal there is to basically like jumpstart your brain to get out of depressive spiraled loops. So the discussion around ECT in here, which was pretty brief, I was kind of like hackles raised. I think if you don't know very much about it, it does seem very scary, and having someone in your life who needs that level of treatment is itself scary. And I think Lee's reaction was very honest to those feelings, but I would have liked for this book to push back against some of those misconceptions around treatment. So that was something that was like a little red flag to me. It wasn't huge. I'm going on and on and on, but this is something that I happen to know a bit about that's very close to my life, like not mine individually, but like, you know, I don't know. I don't want to go super in depth about this, but like that's something I know a lot about in the scheme of like what this book is and what it does and everything that it represents to a lot of people. I think that's really minor, but it's just a little nitpicky thing that I had. Next, I read Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. This I read almost entirely on audiobook, which is just so good. I grew up listening to the Jim Dale narrations. I know a lot of people in the UK are like, Stephen Fry or bust, but I love the Jim Dale versions. I feel super nostalgic about them, and so that was really, really fun to read. This book is a really interesting transition point because although we did see like the kids getting involved in the greater war in the end of Order of the Phoenix, this is where they're really actively involved for the entirety of the book. You have that with Harry and his lessons with Dumbledore. You also have it with Draco. So all of that I think is great. Obviously, the ending is just a gut punch. I love these books so much. And we get to see Ginny being just a badass. It makes me so sad how awful she is in the movies. Like, truly heinous. So to see like an actual cool Ginny is great. Next, I read One Person, No Vote by Carol Anderson. This is nonfiction about voter suppression in the United States. I think this is a really good overview of what's happening, especially for people who aren't super familiar. The structure of the book is great. It keeps everything concise and like very targeted, and I really liked that because you can go off on tangents when it comes to voter suppression. It's pretty short. I think it's like 150 pages total. It looks at the history of disenfranchisement, voter ID laws, purging of the voter rolls. There's kind of like a general other rules being changed, which is kind of about limiting early voting, limiting voting machines, making it difficult to vote by mail, like all of those other issues. And then it also talks about what people are doing to combat it, which was a good note to end on, especially because I finished this after the midterm elections, so I was like a little mad about what went down in a couple states. But I am really excited to see states that had previously been written off as like totally red, no hope of a Democratic win. Seeing the grassroots movements in like Georgia, for example, is so amazing because the fact that Stacey Abrams was so close to winning and should have won were it not for Brian Kemp fucking cheating, that's really heartening to see because that's a state that's been written off as like unwinnable by Democrats for a pretty long time now. And the reason Abrams got so close despite the election literally being rigged against her was because of the grassroots movements led by Georgians, which is just amazing. And all of that is included in here. I liked that this book was unapologetically partisan. I think to be nonpartisan in this kind of instance is ridiculous when one party is rigging the rules. I sometimes thought that the metaphors used in here were like a little derivative, a little corny almost, but overall I think it's a great book. Again, it's really short, so if you want to educate yourself about this, 150 pages, that's nothing. You should read this. Next, I read The Thief by Megan Whalen Turner, and I love this book so much. At this point, I do think I've read it 3 times. I read it when I was really young when it first came out. I'd forgotten I read it and then reread it in high school, I think, and now this is the 3rd time. It's heavily inspired by classical Greece in terms of like the names of things, having a pantheon of God, the literal geography of this world. I think it is just so good. In this, we follow a thief named Jen who has been tasked with thieving, like stealing this mythical object. He's a great character. He's lovable but imperfect. Sometimes I think in fantasy books people like miraculously heal from injuries, and that's not the case in this, which is like a very minor thing that I really enjoyed. I love the series so much and I'm super excited to continue it. So that's it for the books that I read in November. Let me know if you guys have read any of these, what you thought down in the comments below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit subscribe to see more of my face. You can find me on Twitter at PossiblyLit and on Instagram at PossiblyLiterate, and I will see you next time.